The factory stopped listening 16 hours after they fired me. Not completely. That would have been easier. The dangerous failures are always partial. Slow. Intermittent. Just enough confusion to make smart people blame each other instead of the system itself. My name is Daniel Mercer. I am 44 years old, and for 17 years I built operational systems inside Holbrook Dynamics outside Tacoma, Washington. Most executives thought I maintained factory software. That was not true. I maintained synchronization between human decisions, industrial machinery, and automation logic spread across 3 manufacturing buildings running 24 hours a day. The software team understood code. The machinery team understood steel. I understood both. That made me expensive and invisible. The human resources call started at 11:37 on a Tuesday morning. Video conference. Corporate gray background. Scripted sympathy. Forced professionalism. 9 minutes total. I timed it automatically without realizing. The human resources director spoke first. Then Ethan Carlisle took over the conversation after 30 seconds like he had rehearsed it repeatedly in front of a mirror. Young voice. Confident cadence. Harvard Business School vocabulary wrapped around operational ignorance. He called it organizational streamlining. Then he used the word redundancy. That word interested me immediately. Because redundancy inside industrial systems is protection. Remove the wrong layer, and the entire structure starts drifting slowly toward instability. Ethan leaned forward toward the camera carefully while pretending the decision was strategic instead of political. Your operational responsibilities can be redistributed across multiple teams moving forward. Weak sentence. People who truly understand complex systems never use the word redistributed casually, especially inside manufacturing. I looked at the screen quietly while rain moved against my office window behind the monitor. Nobody inside that call understood how many undocumented synchronization routines still depended on manual judgment developed over 17 years of operational crises. Not sabotage, not secret backdoors. Experience, timing, pattern recognition, the invisible map. I asked one question calmly. Who handles building 3 reset coordination now? Silence followed immediately. Ethan answered too fast. The engineering managers can absorb that workflow. Wrong answer. Building 3 did not have a workflow. It had accumulated survival logic. Different thing entirely. During the pandemic equipment shortages, we rebuilt synchronization timing between robotic cutters and packaging conveyors manually after a firmware mismatch nearly destroyed 2 production lines during overnight operations. Nobody documented the final workaround correctly because leadership wanted production restored immediately instead of paused for procedural review. I remembered everything. That was the problem. The human resources director finally interrupted the silence and explained my access would terminate immediately following the call. Severance package. Transition language. Legal disclaimers. Standard corporate choreography. Then Ethan smiled slightly before saying something he probably thought sounded intelligent. This company needs scalable systems now, not dependency on individuals. Interesting sentence. Because scalable systems require people capable of understanding them first. The call ended at 11:46. 9 minutes exactly. At 11:51 my badge access stopped working. At noon my company phone disconnected automatically while I stood inside the parking lot watching forklifts move through the rain behind the factory gates. Nobody from the engineering floor came outside. Not because they did not care. Because they already knew something leadership did not. The night shift expansion started in less than 12 hours. And nobody remaining understood the undocumented synchronization layer connecting automation software to the mechanical sequencing system during production surges. I drove home quietly through wet Tacoma traffic while incoming calls started appearing across my phone screen from old maintenance supervisors and exhausted software leads already hearing rumors internally. I ignored every call. Not emotional. Procedural. I did not work there anymore. At 2:13 the next morning, Building 3 stopped responding to synchronization commands during live production ramp-up. And for the first time in 17 years, nobody inside that factory knew where the failure was actually starting. If you are watching from somewhere that still respects the people holding the invisible map, comment your city below. Building 3 did not fail loudly. That was the first mistake leadership made. Nobody panics when alarms stay silent. The conveyor lines kept moving. Robotic arms continued cycling. Packaging systems still scanned inventory labels correctly across the production floor beneath fluorescent night lighting. From a distance, the factory looked operational. But synchronization had started drifting. Tiny delays first. 3 seconds here. 5 seconds there. Then mechanical timing offsets started colliding with automated sequencing logic during high-volume production ramps. Products entered the packaging line before temperature stabilization completed. Barcode scanners processed inventory faster than pallet systems could physically reposition loads. Robotic sorting arms hesitated briefly before recalculating movements that normally stayed invisible to human operators. Not catastrophic yet, just wrong enough to spread confusion. At 2:41 in the morning, the overnight production supervisor called emergency maintenance after building 3 stopped responding correctly during automated line balancing. The software engineers blamed mechanical calibration. The machinery technicians blamed automation timing logic. Both teams were partially correct, which made the problem worse, because partial truth creates longer failures than obvious mistakes. Inside the executive apartment overlooking downtown Seattle, Ethan Carlisle answered his first emergency operations call at 3:12 in the morning, sounding irritated more than concerned. He still believed the disruption was temporary instability caused by transitional restructuring. That belief lasted another 40 minutes. At 3:56, the factory lost synchronization between the robotic cutters and outbound packaging conveyors during a production surge tied to a major retail shipment scheduled for Chicago distribution. The system started processing faster than the physical equipment could stabilize. Nothing exploded. Nothing dramatic happened. The line simply stopped trusting itself. That is how advanced operational systems collapse. Not through chaos, through hesitation. By sunrise, the night shift engineering team occupied the central operations room beneath cold white monitors, displaying conflicting production metrics nobody could fully explain. Senior technicians reviewed system logs repeatedly, while maintenance crews recalibrated machinery that was never actually broken. Sophia Tran entered the operations room quietly at 6:24, carrying overnight incident reports beneath one arm. She watched the arguments between software and machinery teams for nearly 2 minutes before speaking once. What changed yesterday? Simple question. Dangerous question. Nobody answered immediately because everyone already knew the answer privately. Daniel Mercer disappeared from the system yesterday. Ethan arrived at the factory shortly after 7 wearing a dark overcoat and controlled executive confidence, while managers flooded him with production data, shipment concerns, and overnight downtime losses already approaching 6 figures. He responded the way inexperienced executives always respond during invisible failures. Faster pressure, more meetings, more escalation. He demanded hourly updates. He demanded root cause analysis. He demanded accountability. Wrong strategy. Because nobody inside that building understood the system well enough to isolate the actual dependency layer anymore. At 8:13, one exhausted automation engineer finally admitted something inside the operations room that changed the atmosphere completely. Daniel handled manual synchronization overrides personally during high-load transitions. Silence followed immediately. Ethan stared toward the engineer sharply. Why was that not documented? The engineer answered carefully without looking directly at him. Because leadership rejected the preservation budget 3 years ago. That sentence landed harder than anyone expected, especially because Sophia already found the archived budget request overnight. Daniel submitted it repeatedly. Process Preservation Initiative, Cross-Functional Operational Mapping, Synchronization Dependency Documentation. Denied every quarter. Too expensive. Too slow. Low strategic priority. At 9:37, Ethan finally called my personal phone directly while standing inside the factory control room, surrounded by executives pretending not to panic. I watched the screen vibrate across my kitchen counter while morning rain moved outside the windows quietly. Ignored. Not emotional. Procedural. 3 minutes later, another call arrived from a maintenance supervisor I respected deeply. Then another from software engineering. Then another from operations leadership. Ignored. Because boundaries become very clear after termination paperwork finalizes. Meanwhile, the factory continued drifting further away from stable synchronization during active production load balancing. By noon, the Chicago shipment deadline became mathematically impossible without restoring building 3 sequencing stability. Then Sophia discovered something buried inside archived migration notes from 11 years earlier. The undocumented bridge layer between machinery timing and software sequencing only existed inside one operational notebook Daniel kept personally during emergency transitions. And nobody knew where that notebook was now. The first client escalation arrived before lunch. That changed everything. Internal failures create stress. External visibility creates fear. At 11:18, the Chicago distribution partner requested an emergency production status review after shipment telemetry stopped updating correctly across outbound logistics systems. 3 delayed freight loads already missed scheduled departure windows, and nobody inside Holbrook Dynamics could give a stable completion estimate anymore. Because nobody trusted the production timing data now. The factory floor still moved. That was the problem. The machinery looked operational, while the synchronization layer underneath kept drifting further away from reliable sequencing logic every hour. Conveyor timing slowed unpredictably during high-load transitions. Robotic sorting arms recalculated positioning twice before executing movements. Automated quality scanners processed products faster than stabilization temperatures completed across the packaging zone. Nothing fully failed. Everything degraded. That kind of instability terrifies experienced operators more than catastrophic shutdowns. At least obvious failures stopped moving. These systems kept pretending they were healthy. Inside the emergency operations room, Ethan Carlisle stood beside the central production display, speaking in polished executive language, while exhausted engineers reviewed overnight system logs beneath fluorescent lighting and stale coffee smell. We need faster diagnostics and cleaner escalation ownership. Meaningless sentence. The engineers stopped listening emotionally almost immediately. Because production teams can detect fake authority faster than executives realize. One senior automation technician finally turned toward Ethan after another failed synchronization reset attempt. We do not know which dependencies Daniel adjusted manually during surge balancing. Ethan folded his arms tightly, then rebuilt the process mapping. The technician stared at him silently for 2 seconds before answering carefully. That would take months. Wrong room for optimism. Nobody inside operations needed motivational leadership anymore. They needed institutional memory. And the institution had terminated it yesterday through a 9-minute human resources call. Sophia Tran remained near the rear wall reviewing archived engineering tickets quietly while the arguments escalated between software analysts and mechanical systems managers. Then she noticed something buried inside an 11-year-old migration record tied to building 3 infrastructure upgrades. Manual timing offsets. Undocumented. Personally validated by Daniel during every production surge event since the migration crisis. Sophia read the note twice slowly before looking toward the operations floor through reinforced glass windows overlooking the factory below. Forklifts moved continuously between pallet zones while warning indicators flickered intermittently across the conveyor network. Then she understood the real problem. Daniel was not maintaining software. He was maintaining stability between systems that were never fully compatible in the first place. That realization changed the atmosphere instantly once she explained it aloud. Because now leadership understood the factory was not losing an employee. It lost the human translation layer connecting incompatible operational realities together. At 2:36, Ethan finally stopped calling me personally and escalated through the founder instead. Richard Holbrook called while I sat alone inside a quiet diner near Commencement Bay, reviewing private consulting inquiries already arriving through old industry contacts. I let the phone ring 6 times before answering. Richard skipped introductions completely. How unstable is building 3 right now? Interesting question. Not how to fix it. Not can you help. Just severity assessment. I stirred black coffee slowly before answering. Depends on production load balancing. Silence followed briefly. Then Richard lowered his voice. Daniel, we have clients watching this in real time now. Accurate statement. Not my problem anymore. I answered calmly. I do not work there. Another silence. Longer this time. Because executives always struggle when operational leverage leaves institutional control permanently. Richard finally asked the dangerous question. Did you intentionally leave the system undocumented? Wrong assumption. I looked through the diner window toward gray rain drifting across the harbor before responding. No, leadership intentionally delayed documentation every year because downtime reduction mattered more than preservation budgets. That answer landed heavily, even through silence. Back inside the factory, another emergency reset attempt failed during active line balancing at 4:17 in the afternoon. This time, the instability spread into outbound pallet coordination, forcing partial shutdowns across two packaging zones simultaneously. The overnight downtime losses crossed $1.8 million before sunset. Then Sophia discovered something worse hidden inside Daniel's archived maintenance records. Building 3 was scheduled for maximum holiday production surge testing in less than 48 hours. The executive boardroom overlooked the entire factory complex through 40 feet of reinforced glass. That view usually impressed investors. Tonight it looked like a surveillance deck above a slow-moving disaster. Rain hammered against the windows while production alerts continued appearing across the wall monitors one after another beneath dim recessed lighting. Delayed outbound loads. Conveyor synchronization warnings. Thermal stabilization inconsistencies. Escalating downtime estimates. Nobody touched the catered food anymore. At 7:48, Richard Hallbrook entered the room, carrying printed overnight loss projections beneath one arm, while senior leadership avoided eye contact instinctively. Ethan Carlisle stood near the operations display, pretending composure still existed inside the building. It did not. The factory remained technically operational, but the system underneath had started fragmenting into isolated departments, blaming each other for failures nobody fully understood anymore. Software blamed calibration drift. Maintenance blamed automation logic. Operations blamed communication failures. Nobody blamed the real issue yet. Invisible dependency loss. Sophia Tran connected her laptop quietly to the main conference screen while leadership reviewed shipment penalties tied to missed retail deadlines. Then she opened archive documentation requests Daniel Mercer submitted repeatedly over 7 years. Knowledge Preservation Initiative. Cross-functional synchronization mapping. Emergency operational dependency records. Every proposal denied. Every warning documented. Richard read through the files silently, while Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside the display wall. Sophia continued carefully. Daniel identified tribal knowledge concentration risk multiple times during restructuring reviews. That phrase changed the atmosphere immediately. Because tribal knowledge sounds harmless until companies discover entire industrial systems depend on it invisibly. Ethan tried recovering control quickly. Then why was critical operational knowledge never formalized into scalable systems? Weak defense. Sophia answered before anyone else could. Because leadership prioritized production continuity over documentation downtime every quarter since 2016. No emotion, just timestamps. That was worse. Inside corporate investigations, evidence destroys people faster than emotional accusations. Richard finally looked toward Ethan directly for the first time all evening. Did you review these preservation requests before approving the restructuring? Tiny hesitation. Dangerous hesitation. Then Ethan answered carefully. I reviewed operational summaries, not individual engineering escalation histories. Wrong answer again. Because executive authority without operational awareness becomes liability once systems destabilize publicly. Meanwhile, downstairs, the overnight engineering teams attempted another synchronization reset across Building 3 during reduced production load testing. For 11 minutes, the factory stabilized almost completely. Conveyor sequencing realigned. Thermal timing normalized. Robotic sorting latency disappeared temporarily. Then the surge balancing routines activated automatically. Everything drifted again. One exhausted automation engineer finally removed his headset and said something nobody inside the operations floor wanted to hear aloud. Daniel never automated the balancing layer fully because the machinery evolved faster than the software infrastructure. He adjusted the timing manually during live production transitions. Silence spread across the room immediately, because everyone finally understood the same terrifying reality at once. The factory had not been running on complete automation. It had been running on Daniel. At 9:12, Richard called me again, this time from the executive boardroom directly. I answered while reviewing consulting contracts quietly inside my apartment overlooking Commencement Bay. Soft jazz played faintly from another room, while Seattle rain moved across the harbor outside. Completely different atmosphere from the factory panic spreading 20 miles away. Richard skipped executive language entirely this time. How bad does holiday surge testing become without you? Better question. Finally, I leaned back slowly before answering. Depends whether anyone remembers the secondary timing offsets between buildings 2 and 3. Silence again. Longer now. Then Richard asked carefully, there are secondary offsets? That answer told me everything. Nobody remaining understood the architecture deeply enough even to know the hidden dependencies existed. I closed my eyes briefly before responding. The factory was upgraded in layers for 17 years. Different systems speak different operational languages internally. I translated between them manually during surge balancing. Richard said nothing after that, because for the first time he realized the company had not terminated an employee. It terminated the human bridge holding incompatible systems together. At 11:34 that night, the second production line started drifting during live holiday surge simulation testing. The factory stopped pretending around 3 in the morning. That was the turning point. Until then, leadership still believed the instability could be isolated through enough meetings, enough pressure, and enough executive confidence. Then the outbound logistics system froze during active holiday surge balancing. Not the machinery, the coordination layer underneath it. Pallet sequencing stopped matching production velocity across buildings 2 and 3, while robotic transport units kept receiving conflicting timing instructions from automation control software no longer aligned with live mechanical throughput. The entire facility slowed unevenly like a heartbeat losing rhythm. Forklifts started waiting for clearance signals that never stabilized. Conveyor lanes backed up unpredictably beneath fluorescent warehouse lighting. Emergency staging zones filled with partially processed inventory, while exhausted supervisors shouted updated routing instructions across radio channels nobody trusted anymore. Every delay created another delay behind it. Industrial drift, the most expensive kind. At 3:27, the overnight operations director ordered partial production shutdowns across 2 packaging corridors after synchronization mismatches triggered thermal stabilization risks during outbound preparation. That decision alone delayed for major retail shipments scheduled for Midwest distribution. The financial loss estimates changed every 20 minutes now. Nobody trusted those numbers either. Inside the Executive Operations Center, Ethan Carlisle stopped sounding polished entirely. His tie hung loose beneath cold monitor light, while engineering leads flooded the room with overlapping escalation reports, failed reset attempts, and conflicting diagnostics generated by systems nobody completely understood anymore. Then someone asked the question executives hate most during operational collapse. Who actually knows how this place works? Nobody answered immediately, because everyone already knew. Sophia Tran remained seated near the rear conference wall reviewing archived maintenance escalation records while leadership spiraled into fragmented decision-making. Then she found another buried detail hidden inside Daniel Mercer's old transition notes from a failed infrastructure upgrade nearly 8 years earlier. Emergency balancing sequence requires live human interpretation during surge conditions, not automation. Human interpretation. That sentence spread across the room quietly like poison, because it destroyed the central assumption Ethan built the restructuring around. The assumption that systems were fully scalable independent of individuals. They were not. They never were. Daniel simply made the instability invisible for 17 years. At sunrise, the founder walked the production floor personally for the first time in months. Richard Holbrook moved through the warehouse beneath blinking warning indicators, while supervisors rerouted stalled outbound loads manually around failed synchronization zones. Technicians crouched beside conveyor systems reviewing timing inconsistencies that looked random to outsiders but felt disturbingly familiar to experienced operators. Nobody joked anymore. Nobody blamed each other anymore either. That stage had passed. Now the factory feared itself. At 7:14, a major retail client threatened contractual penalties during an emergency conference call after learning holiday inventory shipments would miss guaranteed delivery windows across multiple distribution hubs. Legal teams joined the discussion immediately. Then outside counsel requested operational continuity documentation. Bad moment. Because nobody could explain continuity planning for systems dependent on undocumented human intervention from a terminated employee. Inside the boardroom, Ethan finally lost emotional control publicly for the first time. He slammed a production report against the conference table and demanded someone bring Daniel back temporarily to stabilize the factory. Wrong phrasing. Temporary meant disposable again. Richard looked at him coldly across the table. You terminated the only operational bridge inside this company without understanding what he actually controlled. No response followed, because there was no defense left now. Only consequences. Meanwhile, I sat quietly inside a waterfront hotel lounge south of Seattle reviewing consulting proposals arriving through private industry contacts, already hearing rumors about Holbrook Dynamics spreading through manufacturing circles. My phone vibrated constantly across the table. Operations managers. Vice presidents. Unknown numbers from corporate legal offices. Ignored. Then at 8:03 Richard called again personally. This time his voice sounded older. Daniel, what would it take for you to come back inside that building? Important sentence. Not help us. Not advise us. Come back. I looked through the lounge windows toward gray water moving beneath low morning clouds before answering calmly. You already removed my authority. The system followed your decision. Silence settled heavily across the line. Then Richard asked the question that finally revealed the full scale of the disaster. If the surge balancing fails completely tonight, can the equipment recover safely without you there? I answered honestly. I do not know anymore. And for the first time since the crisis began, nobody inside Holbrook Dynamics felt in control of the factory at all. The first executive apology arrived through legal counsel. That told me the panic had become institutional. Companies apologize emotionally. Lawyers apologize strategically. At 9:16 that morning, an outside employment attorney representing Holbrook Dynamics requested an emergency conversation regarding operational continuity cooperation. Interesting phrase. Not reinstatement. Not accountability. Cooperation. I read the message twice while sitting inside a quiet marina cafe overlooking gray water and motionless sailboats drifting against low Pacific Northwest clouds. The contrast felt almost unreal compared to the chaos still spreading through the factory 20 miles away. Then I closed the email. No response. Because desperate corporations move faster when silence forces them to measure consequences fully. Meanwhile, inside Building 3, another synchronization drift event triggered emergency production throttling during active surge balancing. The facility technically remained operational, but only through increasingly unstable manual interventions performed by exhausted engineers improvising solutions they barely understood. Temporary fixes stacked on temporary fixes. Dangerous pattern. Every industrial system eventually punishes improvisation. At 11:42, Ethan Carlisle appeared on an internal leadership call, looking physically different than he had 48 hours earlier. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Collar unbuttoned. Voice tighter now. Less polished. Less certain. The board wants operational stabilization before market open Monday morning. Nobody answered him immediately, because everyone inside the room already knew stabilization was impossible without restoring the missing dependency layer Daniel Mercer carried privately for 17 years. Sophia Tran finally spoke while reviewing overnight risk assessments quietly from the end of the conference table. We are operating without verified synchronization governance right now. Corporate language. Translation. Nobody can guarantee the factory behaves predictably anymore. That sentence changed the room completely. Because operational inconvenience creates stress. Governance exposure creates fear at executive level, especially after legal counsel becomes involved. At 1:13 in the afternoon, Richard Holbrook requested an in-person meeting. Neutral location. Private conversation. No lawyers present initially. I agreed. Not emotional. Procedural. We met inside a quiet steakhouse south of Seattle near the waterfront business district. Midday crowd. Soft jazz. Expensive silence. Richard arrived alone wearing the same dark overcoat from the boardroom crisis footage circulating internally among employees already discussing executive failures through private group chats. He looked tired. Older too. Not from lack of sleep. From sudden clarity. Executives age quickly once systems stop obeying authority. Richard sat across from me without opening the menu. Then he asked the first intelligent question leadership had asked since the termination call. What exactly did we lose when you left? Better. Much better. I folded my hands calmly before answering. You lost the operational translation layer between automation logic and physical production behavior. Richard stayed silent, listening carefully now. So explain it to me directly. I looked through the restaurant windows toward cargo cranes moving slowly across Elliott Bay before continuing. The software predicts ideal timing. The machinery responds to physical stress differently every season, every production cycle, every surge condition. Over 17 years, I built manual balancing sequences compensating for drift nobody else tracked consistently. Richard exhaled slowly. Then he asked the question he should have asked years earlier. Why was that knowledge never institutionalized completely? Simple answer. Leadership kept prioritizing uninterrupted production over operational preservation downtime. Documentation projects were delayed repeatedly because the system appeared stable externally. Appeared stable. Important distinction. Factories rarely collapse suddenly. Usually one person spends years quietly preventing collapse every day until executives decide that person looks unnecessary on organizational charts. Richard lowered his eyes briefly toward the table before speaking again. Daniel, the board authorized me to bring you back immediately. Interesting wording. Bring you back. Like nothing happened. I answered carefully. Under what structure? That question stopped him cold. Because structure was the real issue now. Not salary. Not title. Control. Richard finally spoke more cautiously. What would your conditions be? Outside the restaurant, rain drifted across the harbor while cargo ships disappeared slowly into low gray fog. Inside, the silence stretched long enough for Richard to understand the leverage had already reversed completely. Then I answered calmly. Full operational authority over systems governance. Direct reporting access to you only. Independent preservation budget approval. Executive interference protections. Triple compensation. Richard stared at me silently for several seconds. Not shocked. Calculating. Because deep down he already knew the factory was still one unstable surge cycle away from catastrophic operational failure. The board approved my conditions faster than I expected. That was the clearest sign the factory was already closer to collapse than leadership admitted publicly. Corporations negotiate slowly during confidence. They move instantly during fear. By 6 that evening, the revised executive agreement arrived through outside counsel with emergency authorization signatures attached from both Richard Holbrook and the Board Compensation Committee. Triple compensation. Full operational governance authority. Direct reporting access to the founder only. Independent preservation funding protections. One additional clause caught my attention immediately. Executive restructuring authority suspended pending operational review. Meaning Ethan Carlisle already lost control internally. Not publicly yet, but structurally. Important difference. I reviewed the agreement quietly inside my apartment while rain drifted across the Tacoma waterfront outside. No celebration. No satisfaction. Just confirmation. Systems always reveal real power eventually. Not titles. Not charisma. Dependency. At 7:34, another emergency escalation reached the board after overnight surge simulations destabilized outbound sequencing again during live production balancing. This time, automated routing delays spread into supplier synchronization networks tied to incoming material schedules. The instability was escaping the building now. That frightened investors more than downtime losses. Because internal problems can be hidden temporarily. Supply chain instability becomes visible everywhere. Inside the executive conference room, Ethan Carlisle sat alone reviewing operational reports beneath dim lighting, while outside counsel finalized restructuring authority suspensions tied to the emergency governance intervention. Nobody informed him officially yet. Sophia Tran entered quietly carrying updated incident projections. She placed the documents on the table without emotion. 3 additional clients requested continuity assurances today. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face slowly before speaking. We stabilize operations first, then governance cleanup later. Sophia answered carefully. Operations failed because governance cleanup never happened earlier. Direct hit. No anger. Just precision. That made it worse. At 8:12, Richard called me personally again while executive legal teams prepared emergency transition protocols for my return. Can you stabilize the system tonight? Straight question. Finally, I answered honestly. Probably. Probably was enough. Because nobody else inside Holbrook Dynamics could even offer probability anymore. The factory stopped producing certainty 2 days earlier when leadership terminated the person translating instability into invisible corrections quietly every night for 17 years. At 9:06, my temporary executive credentials activated remotely again. Full systems clearance. Full operational override access. Immediate authority restoration across all production infrastructure. No celebration inside the company followed. Only relief. Tired relief. The dangerous kind that appears after people realize disaster might stop spreading before total collapse arrives. I drove toward the factory beneath cold rain and industrial fog hanging low across Tacoma port traffic, while incoming emergency alerts continued flashing across the secured operational tablet legal counsel issued 30 minutes earlier. Conveyor drift escalation. Thermal sequencing inconsistency. Robotics recalibration conflict. The same symptoms. Same disease. Nobody remaining understood the balancing architecture deeply enough to stop the drift permanently. When my truck entered the outer security gate at 10:14, the night shift mechanics standing near Building 3 stopped talking immediately. One exhausted technician simply nodded once while another whispered something toward a younger engineer, too quietly for me to hear fully. Then the younger engineer said it louder. He came back. Interesting sentence. Not management returned. Not leadership arrived. He came back. Because operational teams do not trust titles during crisis. They trust whoever understands reality best. Inside the main control room, every conversation stopped the moment I walked through the door. Ethan stood near the operations wall display looking physically diminished beneath cold monitor light, while synchronization failures continued flashing red across the production dashboards behind him. Nobody introduced us. Nobody needed to. The room already understood the hierarchy changed. Ethan stepped toward me carefully, like someone approaching unstable machinery. Can you stabilize Building 3? I looked toward the live production feed silently for several seconds before answering. Only if nobody interrupts the sequence this time. Then I removed my jacket slowly, placed it across the back of an empty operations chair, and walked toward the central systems console while the entire room watched quietly. Because somewhere underneath the factory, hidden beneath 17 years of layered infrastructure, the invisible map was still drifting further away from stability every minute. The factory became quiet first. That was how I knew the stabilization sequence was finally working. Not because alarms disappeared, because hesitation disappeared. Inside advanced production systems, healthy operations sound confident. Conveyor timing stabilizes into rhythm. Robotic movements stop recalculating mid-cycle. Forklift traffic flows without interruption. Human operators stop staring nervously at monitors every 30 seconds. The building exhales. At 10:38, I accessed the live synchronization architecture through the central operations console, while exhausted engineers surrounded the control room silently beneath cold fluorescent light. Nobody interrupted. Nobody questioned the sequence adjustments. Even Ethan stayed quiet now. Good decision. I reviewed the balancing logs for less than 4 minutes before finding the real fracture point hidden beneath layers of emergency resets attempted during the previous 48 hours. Not software corruption. Not machinery failure. Accumulated timing distortion. Every failed stabilization attempt pushed the operational drift further away from its original synchronization baseline, until the entire production ecosystem started compensating against itself automatically. Exactly what I warned leadership about repeatedly for years. I entered the first manual correction sequence carefully while monitoring thermal throughput variance across Building 3 live production feeds. Conveyor pacing slowed temporarily. Robotics latency normalized by 0.8 seconds. Pallet sequencing stabilized gradually across outbound staging zones. The room stopped breathing. Then the balancing layer locked correctly for the first time since my termination. One engineer whispered something under his breath. Nobody reacted, because everyone was watching the monitors instead. At 11:19, outbound logistics synchronization returned across all active production corridors simultaneously. The warning indicators disappeared one by one across the operations wall, while live shipment estimates recalculated automatically back into stable ranges. Not perfect. Stable. That mattered more. Richard Holbrook arrived inside the control room 20 minutes later while operations teams restored suspended production schedules cautiously across both facilities. He watched the stabilization metrics silently for nearly a full minute before speaking. How close were we? Important question. Not financially. Operationally. I kept reviewing live balancing diagnostics while answering calmly. Another surge cycle probably would have destabilized outbound coordination completely. Then the equipment protection systems would have started isolating production sectors automatically. Richard understood immediately. Partial facility shutdowns. Millions per day. Client exposure. Regulatory review. Supply chain escalation. Real damage. Not executive embarrassment. Meanwhile, Sophia Tran finalized the preliminary governance report inside a smaller conference room overlooking the operations floor. She documented everything chronologically, denied preservation requests, delayed documentation initiatives, dependency concentration warnings ignored during restructuring planning, executive override decisions bypassing operational review, no emotional language, no accusations, just timestamps. Corporate disasters become lethal once calm documentation enters the room. Around midnight, Richard requested a private conversation inside the upper executive office overlooking the factory complex. Rain still moved against the windows while production traffic stabilized below across loading docks glowing beneath industrial floodlights. Richard removed his glasses slowly before speaking. You kept this company alive longer than we understood. Interesting sentence. Not praise. Recognition. Different thing. I answered carefully. The system survived because people on the floor adapted continuously. I just translated instability before leadership noticed it. Richard looked down briefly toward the governance report Sophia completed less than an hour earlier. Then he asked quietly, "Why did you stay so long?" Simple answer. Because the people actually running the factory deserved stability even when leadership stopped valuing preservation. That sentence stayed inside the room for several seconds without movement. Then Richard slid a signed executive authorization packet across the desk toward me. Head of Operations Systems. Immediate effect. Full governance authority approved unanimously by the board. I reviewed the signature pages silently while the factory lights reflected across wet Tacoma pavement outside. One name was missing. Ethan Carlisle. Richard noticed immediately. His restructuring authority ended tonight. No drama followed that statement. No victory speech. Just institutional gravity settling into place quietly after 48 hours of operational panic. Then Richard asked the question that mattered most. Can this place ever become stable without depending on one person again? I looked through the office glass toward the production floor below where exhausted technicians finally moved without fear across synchronized conveyor lanes again. Then I answered honestly. Only if leadership learns the difference between reducing headcount and understanding systems. 1 year later, the factory sounded different. Healthier. Not because the machinery changed. Because the company finally stopped pretending operational knowledge was replaceable simply because it looked invisible on executive spreadsheets. The preservation division occupied an entire floor now inside the main Tacoma facility. Cross-functional dependency mapping. Institutional memory documentation. Live operational simulation training. Emergency synchronization governance. The things leadership called unnecessary before the collapse. Now they funded them aggressively. Fear creates budgets faster than wisdom ever does. My office overlooked Building 3 through reinforced glass, where synchronized conveyor systems moved with steady mechanical rhythm beneath cold industrial lighting. New engineers rotated through preservation workshops weekly, while senior technicians documented transition procedures previously trapped inside private notebooks and exhausted memories. No single person controlled the invisible map anymore. That was the point. Sophia Tran became vice president of operational governance 6 months after the crisis ended. Quiet promotion. No celebration. Just institutional recognition finally aligning with reality. Her governance framework became mandatory across every facility owned by Holbrook Dynamics nationwide. Every undocumented dependency required review now. Every operational concentration risk triggered automatic escalation. Every executive restructuring proposal required systems preservation analysis before approval. Painful lesson. Expensive lesson. Permanent lesson. As for Ethan Carlisle, the board never terminated him publicly. That would have created headlines investors might remember too easily. Instead, his authority disappeared gradually behind organizational restructuring language and strategic reassignment discussions that sounded polished externally while meaning something much colder internally. He left 7 months later. Quietly. No farewell speech. No leadership tribute. Just another executive badge deactivated after business hours. Interesting symmetry. The difference was simple. When Ethan disappeared, the factory kept working perfectly. That detail mattered more than anything else. Richard Holbrook understood it too. 3 weeks before the annual leadership summit, he asked me privately if I wanted to address the executive teams personally regarding operational dependency risk management. I accepted, not for revenge, for accuracy. The conference room overlooked Elliott Bay beneath heavy winter clouds while senior leadership teams from across the country reviewed modernization plans, automation investments, and restructuring proposals projected across massive presentation screens. Same kind of room where executives usually discuss efficiency. Different atmosphere now. Because everyone inside Holbrook Dynamics remembered what happened when leadership confused visibility with value. I stood near the center of the room, quietly, while the final slide displayed a simple sentence across a black background. The most dangerous system dependency is the one leadership cannot see. Nobody checked their phones anymore. Nobody whispered. I explained how advanced operational environments fail gradually before they fail publicly. How undocumented human interpretation layers evolve naturally across long-term industrial systems. How executives obsessed with organizational simplification often destroy the exact stabilizers protecting them from catastrophic drift. No dramatic language. No bitterness. Just operational truth. When the presentation ended, Richard remained seated silently for several seconds before speaking toward the room. We nearly lost this company because we measured labor visibility instead of operational consequence. Accurate statement. Late realization. Still valuable. After the summit ended, I walked alone through the upper production bridge overlooking Building 3 while synchronized machinery moved beneath the glass floors steadily across the midnight shift. Forklifts flowed through calibrated traffic lanes. Conveyor timing remained stable. Robotics sequencing adjusted smoothly beneath live surge balancing loads. The building sounded confident again, not because the systems became simpler, because the company finally respected complexity instead of pretending PowerPoint slides could replace experience. I stopped briefly near the center overlook where 17 years earlier I watched the first synchronization migration begin during a freezing winter outage nobody remembers anymore except me. Funny thing about invisible work. People only notice it after it disappears. That is the real danger inside modern corporations. Not incompetence alone. Arrogance toward the people quietly preventing failure every day. Because companies rarely collapse from one catastrophic mistake. Usually they collapse after removing the person who understood how close the system already was to drifting apart.